Welcome, everybody. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for Study of Slavery and Abolition. This is a symposium that began, I got thinking about it a year ago, when James Bundy invited us to lunch and said, how about you do a symposium or a panel while we're having Father Comes Home. And this is that panel, a star-studded panel. I want to thank a few people first. First from the Yale Rep, the folks that helped us put all this together, Jocelyn Prince and Jennifer Kiger, who are here. I also want to point out that one of the actors in this play, sorry, oh dear. I'm sorry, who am I missing? Julian, right? And, oh, right. You guys were too, well, I won't go into it all. I think you were terrific. Anyway, Father Comes Home, a Civil War Odyssey. This panel is full of expertise, tremendous expertise about this subject, so I'm going to leave it to them. All I want to say is that as a historian of slavery, emancipation, and the Civil War, if you haven't seen this yet, it's a powerful, ambivalent, deep rendering of the meaning of emancipation, and not a romantic conception of emancipation. But that too is probably, with Suzan-Lori Parks, that too is probably up for debate. I'm going to introduce the panel quite quickly and then hand it over to my colleague, Daphne Brooks. Daphne is a professor in the African American Studies Department and in Theater Studies, and I think she's got at least 2 other departments. She's written now at least 2 books. One is called Bodies in Dissent, Spectacular Performances in Race and Freedom from the Middle of the 19th Century to 1910. She's also written the book Jeff Buckley's Grace, and she's currently working on a book called Subterranean Blues, Black Women, Sound Modernity, which will be with Harvard University Press. Daphne will moderate this panel. Tara Hunter is a historian, professor of history and African American Studies at Princeton. She used to teach also at Carnegie Mellon. She's a historian of gender, women's history, African American history in the 19th and the 20th century. Her first book was called To Joy My Freedom, Southern Black Women's Lives and Labors After the Civil War, which is a study of women in Atlanta and other southern cities. She's also the author of a brand new book called Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century. And marriage, as many of you know, is a complicated theme in this play as well. Brandon Jacobs Henkins is a playwright. What did I say? Henkins. Sorry.
It's okay. It's a story of my life.
Oh, it's a typo.
Oh.
Sorry. Brandon, I'm sorry for the typo. That's all my fault. Anyway, he's a playwright. He won the 2014 Obie Award for his plays An Octoroon and the play entitled Appropriate. His play War debuted here at the Yale Rep in 2014. He has lectured here at Yale. He's also a MacArthur Fellow, among many other things. Mike Lemonew is a professor of American literature at Clemson, and a former fellow here at our center at the GLC 2 years ago or 3 years ago. He was one of those keepers we wish we could have kept, but he had to go to his regular job. He's the author of the book called Fictions of Fact and Value, The Erasure of Logical Positivism in American Literature. He's co-editor of a book called Wittgenstein and Modernism, and he is currently writing a book I can't wait for, that's a study of Civil War literature from the Civil Rights Movement to the present. He is rewriting the magnificent and confounding book by Edmund Wilson called Patriotic Gore, And I've never known anyone else who had the courage to even attempt such a book. But that's the book Mike is writing. He's also written about Suzan-Lori Parks. He published in African American Review an essay entitled The Theater of Hustle and the Hustle Theater, Player, and Played in Suzan-Lori Parks' Top Dog Underdog. He also just taught an honors seminar at Clemson, he tells me, in which they read this play. And lastly, Harvey Young is Dean of the Boston University College of Fine Arts. He did his BA here at Yale, his MA at SUNY Buffalo, PhD at Cornell. He's written 7 books, including the book Embodying Black Experience, and another book entitled Black Theater is Black Life, an Oral History of Chicago Theater. He's the president of the Association for Theater and Higher Education, and a member of boards and committees at many different theaters, including on the board of the Yale Club of Chicago. But anyway, welcome all of you, and Daphne, it's all yours. And I apologize, by the way, I have to leave at 6 p.m. to catch a flight to Charlottesville. The Civil War just won't go away, neither will its monuments, so I have to slip out before it's over.
God, what an introduction. Thank you, David Blight. Thank my colleague, Professor David Blight, for the kind and the thoughtful introductions. And as we indicated, we're going to start our discussion by having each of our panelist participants speak, and then we'll move into our conversation with one another. We'll also be sure to leave time for our audience Q&A later during our time together. Before we begin, I'd like to once again recognize the efforts of the cast and creative team of this production for continuing to keep alive the wondrous and daring repertoire of playwright Suzan-Lori Parks, alive and vibrantly circulating in our current world, as if she needs any help with that, right? But still, on a day like today, as we think about places like Sacramento, California, but also all of those other perilous sites of precarity for the marginalized and the dispossessed at the border, in the carceral state and elsewhere, we remain so grateful for her brand of drama, which endlessly reminds us of our entanglements with the past that is never past, right? To experience a Susie play is to affirm the necessity of recognizing, as both Toni Morrison as well as our wonderful friend, the pooch Odyssey, insist that the story of slavery and freedom is not a story to pass on, but a story to pass on. So as many critics have noted, and as the playwright herself has said, and I believe my esteemed, wonderful colleague Harvey Young has meditated on this particular formulation and his extensive work on Susie's work, Parks has endlessly set herself to perpetually mining the great whole of history, and challenging us to accompany her on epic experimental journeys that take us to the edge of whimsy and wonder, as well as the fantastical darkness of our own perplexing ontologies, the evil that men do to one another, the violence that shapes and informs the American historical condition, the struggle for Black folks and especially Black women to reclaim the value, feeling, movement, and invention rooted in and emanating from their own bodies. Her works also attest to the radical and perpetually sly, coded and loaded humor of Black folks' expressive forms, and the ways that those forms were and continue to be put in the service of surviving and subverting captivity and ultimately cultivating fugitive paths towards futurity. And so with history on our minds, I want to turn now to my esteemed former colleague, but always a colleague from those days in New Jersey that were long and dark and difficult. But I had my wonderful colleague from Princeton University, Tara Hunter, by my side. So if I may pass the mic to her to lead us forward into the past that perpetually gets us to the future. So take it away, Professor Hunter.
Thank you to everyone who's come out, to the Yale Rep as well as the Gilder Lehrman Institute, or Center. I always get the two confused. Thanks for inviting me, and especially to the artists who've taken the time to come out. I really appreciate all of you being here. So one of the most interesting elements of Suzan-Lori Parks' play is how it deals with history, which is actually a running theme throughout all of her work. So the play, Father Comes Home from the Wars, is set in a particular historical moment, the Civil War, and yet the play is constantly refusing to consider the past solely in the past tense. Through language, styling, and gestures, the audience continually is prodded to think about the past as present tense. The most enduring questions about the meaning of freedom are especially rife, not only posed in terms of what the concept meant in the context of the Civil War, but also to what extent they remain relevant ever since. What does freedom really mean? And to what extent and in what ways can it ever be fully achieved for African Americans? So I'm going to focus my comments on the community of enslaved people, and especially on Hero and Penny as a couple. Parts 1 and 2 of the play are set in the context of the enslaved community to which the protagonist, Hero, later Ulysses, belongs. The community is made up of a variety of relationships, a surrogate father and son, wife and husband, and various other individuals thrown together by circumstances beyond their control to forge bonds of kinship and near kinship for their survival and betterment. On the surface, various members of the community are taking bets on whether Hero will go to war or not, and what it means for him as a man. Does manhood constitute following his master for the promise of freedom given as a reward for service? Does manhood mean refusing to go and raise a hand against his own cause, as he put it, by aiding the Confederates fighting to preserve the institution of slavery? This also leads to questions about how freedom is produced. Can it be given? Should it be earned? Does the ultimate act of self-assertion, running away, constitute theft and therefore not true liberty, as Hero seems to suggest? And it's interesting that Parks is sort of taking a different turn from the usual depiction of the heroic slave, which is normally in folklore and history depicted as the rebellious slave. But here she's sort of redefining the way a slave might think about theft, not as the original act of stealing another person's labor or stealing another person. These questions are bantered about within the community of enslaved people precisely because freedom presides in individuals, but is always mediated by the collective. The enslaved have to constantly juggle how to consider their individual plight and relationship to their families and friends. What does it mean to gain one's individual freedom if it means leaving behind loved ones who remain in captivity? And Homer reveals another cost. Hero, at an earlier point, had been promised his freedom by the boss to reveal his hideout location. Freedom in exchange for breaking the bonds of trust is the way that Homer described that loaded bargain. Hero is most torn by keeping his father's respect and maintaining his wife's love. And I want to focus in particular on the latter relationship and provide more context for understanding what Black marriage was like in the context of slavery and the Civil War. Enslaved people were not allowed to marry legally, but they were allowed to marry informally with the permission of their masters. And for African Americans, marriage was an emotional bond. It was an affirmation of mutuality, intimacy, and usually love. It was a foundation for building social networks outward from their home base to extended kin and community. And it also had religious meanings for those who were Christians as an expression of their faith. Black heterosexual intimacy comprised a wide range of domestic arrangements out of necessity, not all of which were described as marriage. but most enslaved people did marry. Many of these relationships were formed by spouses who lived on separate plantations. This was called abroad marriages. Many of them were formed in the way that Hero and Penny's relationship were formed, living within the same cabins. Although slave owners refused to grant slaves legal rights to marry, they usually acknowledged that what looked like marriage was marriage de facto, rather than marriage de jure. They did not always understand or share the same idea about what the term meant, and under what circumstances it should be or could be applied to Black intimacy. Slave owners considered marriage only those relationships that they sanctioned and affirmed, but ultimately, they could not dictate personal feelings. Most slaves were allowed to choose their own partners, but some masters did engage in forced couplings. Sex, both inter and intraracial, could be thrust upon slaves for whatever purposes the enslavers desired. But marriage was ultimately a mutual exchange of affections and services, a chosen, emotional, and social bond. Persons could be forced to play the roles and abide by the form, but that did not make a marriage. Penny and Hero's relationship as husband and wife was not disputed. They are acknowledged in their community as such, though at one point in the play, Penny is referred to as almost wife, perhaps as a nod to the particular disabilities imposed on relations of the enslaved. From all appearances, they are a happy and respected couple before Hero leaves for the war. But the war strained their relationship. What did this mean for Penny? Like other women left behind on the home front, as their men were taken away to aid their masters in the Confederate Army, or later when they ran away to fight for the Union. The home front had a tumult of its own as life, as usual, was broken down and normalcy was overturned. Hero encouraged Penny to keep her nose to the ground in his absence, to work hard and mind her mistress. Although he did not have legal rights to protect his wife when present, his absence would have made her more vulnerable still. But we get the sense that Hero's absence has taken a toll on Penny. In part 3, we hear that she has night scares that cause her to yell out in pain and flee from her bed. She yearns for his return. Meanwhile, she has done what other enslaved people would call taking up with Homer. She has not forsaken her relationship with Hero and makes clear that her heart belongs to him, even as she shares a bed with another man in the meantime. She is still Hero's wife. Her hookup, as we would say in today's parlance with Homer, is a relationship of convenience, not love. Hero promised her that he would return at the end of his service in the war. She holds on to that hope that he will. Meanwhile, Hero has embarked on a journey of transformation that he had no way of knowing he would experience before he embarked. Above all, the war took a terrible toll on the men living and fighting on the battlefields. The Civil War was the bloodiest war in our nation's history. Mano a mano, men fought face to face. More men died in this war than all others combined. Anyone who survived might re-examine their sense of self, their relationships, and their place in the world. Black men commonly took on new identities as free men. When Hero returns home with a gift, quote unquote, to Penny in the form of another woman, he calls his wife. It is not completely out of the ordinary, though the manner in which he does it may have been. Odyssey, the dog, has one of the most telling lines in the play. What is faithful at home is not necessarily faithful in the war. Black men fighting for the Union or serving their masters in the Confederacy met women who they took up with en route. Some forgot about their old brides and married new ones. Some tried to maintain relationships with more than one, moving back and forth from one to the other in different locations. Most often, women did not find out about this until later, especially after their husband's death. And we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A if you're interested in how these stories come to light. More rarely, as Ulysses did, he tried to turn a monogamous household into a bigamous one. Circumstances leading to men having two wives were often the product of forced separations and forced couplings with partners not of their choosing. Once couples were parted, they continued to pursue the fulfillment of basic human needs for companionship, affirmation, affection, and solace. Both Hero and Penny did this, not knowing what outcome would await them at the end of the war. Hero and Penny's reckoning of their relationship in Part 3 reflects how all couplings formed under slavery came to a crossroads by the end of the Civil War, where individuals, twosomes, had to decide whether to move forward with the same spouse after slavery ended, and if so, how, or whether to begin or continue other opportunities. Penny and now Ulysses had each been transformed. They were not the same people anymore. Hero did not return, but Ulysses took his place as a new free man. This left Penny a hard choice as a woman. She chose to exercise her own freedom with Homer rather than be subjected to a second wife with the man she truly loved. She leaves with the others on an ambivalent note, however. Ulysses did not tell them that they were free by the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, leaving the audience to ponder how and in what ways will they get their freedom.
Thank you, Professor Hunter. I had the good fortune of meeting my colleague from Clemson University last night for the first time, and I learned some wonderful things about his family, which I won't disclose here, but one of the things that I learned is that his brother publicly has his name pronounced differently from our dear friend from Clemson University. I fear that I'm going to pronounce his name the way in which his brother has. So I'm going to try and do this.
Which one?
But I'm sure you endure this quite a lot. Please join me in welcoming next up. Oh, I want to make sure. Professor LeMahieu.
You kind of split the difference.
Help me out. We've been scrambling names all afternoon already, which is a very Susie Parks thing to do.
Right.
So,
and I'll say something about names.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor
Okay.
Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a cousin of mine, actually, who is a second baseman for the Colorado Rockies and pronounces it differently. And all my efforts to get people to say LeMahieu, just as soon as the announcer started, it's never in my lifetime.
LeMahieu.
So thank you for considering that. I'm also getting over a cold, so if I sound a little stuffy, that's the reason for that. Thank you, Professor Brooks, Professor Blight, Melissa, Tom, everybody at the Gilder Lehrman Center for putting this on and inviting me, and I'm delighted to see so many of the artists and actors here in the audience too. Much of what I'm saying today is not planned in advance. It's about thinking about what I saw last night in the performance. Market. When a phrase recurs as often as this one in a Suzan-Lori Parks play, some dozen times in the first part alone, it's worth remarking. Mark it, hear it, record it, take it down. The phrase initially appears in the context of the characters' respective bets about Hero's pending decision. Will he stay on the plantation or will he go to war, the cotton field or the battlefield? The second chorus member thinks he'll go. That's how I'm betting, mark it. The chorus leader thinks he'll stay, mark it. And I got a good chance of winning too. But the recurrence of the phrase in the opening scene more broadly puts in play a number of familiar tropes and themes of a Suzan-Lori Parks play. And so what I want to do for the introductory remarks I'm making here is kind of situate some of the elements in Father Comes Home from the War in terms of some of the other plays as a way of posing a question that I really haven't quite figured out how to wrap my head around yet, and hopefully that can be part of the discussion that follows. Market. Parks frequently deploys games, bets, and wagers as structuring devices, from the very early betting on the Dust Commander to most famously the three-card monte hustle in Top Dog, Underdog. Betting on Hero's Choice requires, as the title of the first part puts it, a measure of the man. A title I think that alludes perhaps to Stephen Jay Gould's 1981 critique of biological determinism called The Mismeasure of Man. Each of us got to make a measure of the man, one of the chorus members states. We got to choose for ourselves. But this idea of being able to choose for yourself, the very idea of freedom of choice under conditions of slavery, is not just the means of playing the game, but it seems to be the stakes of the game itself. Is there such a thing, and how to make sense of such a notion? The old man wants Hero to, quote, decide your own self, rather than to capitulate to the boss man's illusory freedom of choice, which, he says, takes the place of Hero's rightful freedom. And the fact that in the script, freedom is often capitalized here, and rightful freedom takes capital R, capital F, kind of gives us this quality of an illusory or almost, kind of mythological status. Homer encourages Hero to just refuse the terms of that choice altogether. I say don't. Just don't even go there. There's no, in other words, it's kind of like the three-card monte hustle. You may think you can win. You may think you can choose the red card or the black. There's no winning that. Just don't go there. These questions comprise much of the dramatic conflict and generic form of the first part of Father Comes Home from the Wars. Hero resents his fellow slaves making a game of it, he says, but the leader understands that such games and such bets are the stuff of drama, of tragedy. There is a kind of sport, he remarks, in the consideration of someone else's fate. And Parks has herself made similar comments about watching a play such as Oedipus, in which you know how it's going to end. So the suspense isn't coming from, oh, is he going to avoid that fate? Or is he really going to live at the end? Is he not going to sleep with his mother? Like, no, we know all that stuff's going to happen. But there's a kind of pleasure in seeing that play out over and over. And think of all the repetitions that show up in her work of Booth shooting Lincoln over and over and over again, of the kind of the remarks on repetition and revision, that these things that kind of continually play themselves out, and what pleasure or sport we take in seeing that happen. Even three-card monte, which gives the illusion of an outcome to be decided, we watch the same thing happen over and over again. In this respect, I think it's important when we consider market to remember the advice that Lincoln and Booth give us in Top Dog, Underdog, the advice to us as audience members. The customer is actually called the mark. You know why? Because he's the one you got your eye on. You mark him with your eye. And when we watch a Parks play, it's like we're sitting on the other side of that table, and we're the audience or the mark, and we might be subject to a hustle in the same way that the players are. So this combination of game and drama, two forms of play, come together in Parks's work over and over in questions of history, identity, and inheritance. When the oldest old man, and I think he's a kind of analog to the mentor figure in the Odyssey. Some of the other ones are more obvious, but you'll remember in the first two books of the Odyssey, it's the very old man that Telemachus has to go see, and it's Athena, I think, right, the goddess, who's kind of taking the form of mentor. So the fact that he's in that first part but doesn't show up again is very similar to the way the Odyssey unfolds. The oldest old man distinguishes between real fathers and himself. I didn't make you from my spit, which makes me, I guess, a fake father. He activates a motif that goes back at least 20 years to the America play, whose main character is the foundling father, and whose children refer to him as the faux father, F-A-U-X. So this idea of fake fathers or surrogate fathers, specifically with names like Lincoln or Booth, come up again and again through Parks's kind of meditations on American history. Same thing in Top Dog. You think we're really brothers? I know we're brothers, but is we really brothers? You know, blood brothers. thinking about the relationships and the inheritances that they may or may not share. So these ideas that all get put in play in part one, I think, reappear in different forms in part two. And I just have to say that part two, I feel like we could do the whole roundtable on just that alone, and some of the passages going on there. Hero skepticism concerning Smith's racial identity dissipates only when, as the stage direction puts it, Smith shows Hero a mark on his forearm. Mark it. This mark is meant to signify ownership, and as such it fits into this part of the play's brilliant meditation on freedom, choice, and value, as when the Colonel says to Captain Smith, play along with us and, if you can, using the information provided. If you can determine Hero's original worth, that is, the price he was when he came to me, then he'll be yours. It's that combination there of anachronism of the language of a standardized test, using the information that's provided, and perhaps the most kind of gut-wrenching and moving scene in the play that's very characteristic, I think, of her anachronisms and why sometimes you'll hear an audience not knowing whether to laugh or not about these two things coming together. So I hope we can discuss more about this section, the representation of market value, racial capitalism, determined and performative identities. But I want to conclude with reference to what I think is one of the most trenchant passages in the play, and just read most of it and say a sentence or two. This is Smith admitting to Hero right before they separate at the end of part two. Sometimes I get the feeling that the heart of the thing won't change easy or quick because of the way we were bought and brought over here in the first place. Maybe even with freedom, that mark, that mark of the marketplace, it will always be on us. And so maybe we will always be twisting and turning ourselves into something that is going to bring the best price. That's the way we were born into this. So is it always going to be like that for us? Slavery or not, freedom or not, are we ever going to get us a better place in the marketplace? Market. That mark of the marketplace persists in Parks's reflections of choice under slavery, freedom after emancipation, and the legacies and inheritances, the marks of American history and identity. I'll leave it there for now.
So far we have one of the most influential Black feminist historians of our generation, a scholar who is currently writing a path-breaking study of the Civil War and historical imagination. Immediately to my left is arguably one of the most influential and important Suzan-Lori Parks scholars, Dean Harvey Young, who most recently, although I can't keep up with the number of books he publishes, released a co-edited volume of Susie Parks's interviews and conversations that has been definitive work for us in the field to have that archive of the deeply eccentric and marvelous Parks down for the record, and yet always elusive, is just one of the many gifts that Dean Young has given to us, and so it's my great pleasure to pass the mic now to Dean Young. I'm skipping over you, sir. We'll come back to you.
We had two microphones surrounding Brandon there. Yeah, so it's great to be here. It's fun to be back at Yale. I realized that I think, was it 23 years ago or something like that? I graduated 21 years ago, so I think 23 years ago I was on the debate team here, and we used to host high school debate tournaments, and the headquarters was in this room. So and I don't think I've actually been in this room since then. So it's a little odd. Yeah. So I'm just going to I have a few just points I want to say. I am a theater historian, and what I do is I write about contemporary American theater. And you might say, how does that make sense? How are you a historian who writes about contemporary American theater? And what I do is I offer a forward perspective, because I want us to know, who should we cast the spotlight on? What work should we remember going into the future? What do we want to remain? And to put in perspective, you might say, well, there's awards and accolades that allow you to know sort of who should be preserved for the future. But you can think of someone's work such as like Robert Sherwood's work, the winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes, who engaged in American history throughout his work, sort of Lincoln in Illinois and others, and he's kind of sort of faded, from the stages of American regional theater. And for that reason, it's really important for us to have advocates in the world who can talk about the importance of individual voices and how they speak to a future audience as well as to the present day. So that's the one hat I wear. The other hat that I wear is as a person whose interest and research focuses upon race and performance. I'm interested in how we can think about the performance of race in everyday life and such as socialization. How do we prepare youth, for example, to anticipate the experience of blackness as it impacts their lives, right? So that's something that matters to me. Just a few quick thoughts that will align with this interest of mine. One is Suzan-Lori Parks' fascination with pastiche, right? The sense of these culturally sort of detached signifiers that circulate in the world, that are ripe for the grabbing, right? Sort of like apples for the picking. And in this case, you can think about Homer, the references to the Odyssey, Penelope, Ulysses, and others. And how they exist in our cultural moment as familiar objects that are that are often detached itself from the Odyssey, because it's like you have a familiarity with Homer without ever having read Homer, right? You can know of Ulysses without having any sense of the Odyssey and how the Odyssey traveled across countries over time. And that's the thing that's fascinating to me, is how what Suzan-Lori Parks does is she takes a level of sort of cultural awareness about the humanities and then repurposes that work for her own end, right? So you can think of The Father Comes Home from the Wars, Part 1, 2, and 3. Is it an adaptation of the Odyssey? I would say no. I would say no. Does it gesture toward elements of the Odyssey? Perhaps, right? Is it a means or a vehicle for her to tell her own story? And I would say absolutely so. Now, what I find fascinating in terms of thinking about pastiche and Suzan-Lori Parks is also her fascination, her interest in slippage, right? In the sense of the rep and rev, how market appears again and again and again. She is excited about how language can fold into itself, how it can mean multiple things, how initial appearances are not quite what it seems to be. And that's what gives her piece so much strength. It's also what blends, as Tara was saying, the past and the present within her plays. And we experience that every day in our lives, right? Like we're in this moment where lots of African-American men primarily, but African-Americans in general, are being subjected to violence. And it can be difficult to keep track of names, Trayvon, to Tamir, to Stefan, to Eric, to Freddie, and others. And it's that level of slippage that motivates and her dramaturgy. So you're sitting there, you're watching Father Comes Home from the Wars, parts 1, 2, and 3, right, which is up here, and that question around the meditation of what is the value of Black life, right? So when Hero at that moment, it was a Hero or Ulysses, I'm not sure which, I think it's Hero at that moment, sort of stands before us and says, well, are we worth more, as object and commodity than as a free person? That itself resonates. There's a slippage there that's occurring between the past and the present. When you think about clothing and costuming within the play, and how there's a slippage between the past and the present. And Suzan-Lori Parks does that quite deliberately. In addition, what she does in this sense of slippage, in this blurring that occurs with characters, she's also talking about how characters and people in general are complicated. People are, my friend Tom Bradshaw, who's a playwright, will often say that theater too often celebrates people as virtuous or not, right? As all good or all bad. And really, there's a lot of hypocrisy that exists in the world. And you can see that within her plays, right? So whether it's Venus, and there's the complicated notion of whether or not Sarah Bartman played a role in her own objectification. If it's in The Blood, in which you're wondering whether Hester is a good mother or not a good mother, right? Based upon some of the choices that she makes. Or in the case of this play, right, where at the very end, trying to figure out now this long-awaited Ulysses has returned, and he's returned, to Penny, with a new wife, right? And then trying to figure that out. But in that moment yesterday where people were saying, "Oh no," right? There was a gasp, like how could this happen? just a few minutes earlier, you had that moment between Homer and Penny, right, where it was clear that she was prepared to leave, to go off with Homer. And it's this sense of characters and people and humans are complicated beings. There's a slippage, and that's something that's worth noting. She plays with forms, right? We have a sense of what the chorus is, but within this play, what and who is the chorus in Father Comes Home from the Wars? Is it first, second, third / runaways? Are they the chorus? Is it the musician? Is he the chorus? Is it Odyssey? Is he the chorus, right? Who is the person who's playing this role in terms of connecting us with the narrative, who's propelling the narrative, but also helping us to see what's occurred off stage, and to bring us up to date to the present. And that shifting, that move, again, that slippage, is something that she does extraordinarily well. And the last thing I want to say is that I think that because these plays engage the past and the present, because there's many ways of accessing in terms of cultural interpretation, she really leans upon her audiences to find meaning. So it resonates in many different ways. So your experience as an audience member can vary. And that's certainly part of the reason why it's important to have diverse and inclusive audiences who experience your work, because there's going to be shifting currents in laughter, right? There will be some things that people pick up on that others will not. And the more diverse and inclusive your audience can be, the more impactful her work is, and the more educated fellow audience members are, because they're realizing that they're not seeing and experiencing the work in the same way. And again, that's how slippage is happening within her work. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean Young. So last but not least, adding to our list of superlatives with the distinguished folks we have in our midst, we have arguably one of the most influential playwrights of his generation, on top of being an intellectually daring artist who manages a variety of different cultural expressive forms and experimental, politically, historically minded ways of using theater to imagine new worlds for us. So we have the MacArthur genius playwright Brandon Jacobs-Jenkins here with us today.
I want to thank Professor Brooks, who is actually my former professor, oddly enough, and also all these amazing people on this panel, including Harvey Young, who has written about me, and I'm actually a little shook to be sitting next to you. I'm also traumatized in old and new ways, and this is in keeping in some way with my relationship with Suzan-Lori as a colleague and as an acolyte and as many things, living in her shadow. The new way being that I had no idea that this was a formal panel, and so I did not prepare remarks, so I've spent a lot of the last 30 minutes deciding whether or not I would improvise in the spirit of Suzan-Lori, actually, but I'm going to do something and I also yesterday went to the Adrian Piper retrospective at the MoMA, which is incredible. So I'm sort of living with her spirit of kind of cattiness and productive adoration at the same time. But also thinking about my relationship to Suzan-Lori, and I guess specifically this play as an old trauma, in that I wrote a play called Nocturne, which premiered in the same year as Father Comes Home from the War. And it's been sort of interesting to feel the ways in which her play is haunting me and has haunted my play and haunts the life of the play in positive ways that I would call positive. One early trauma was that we, both Nocturne and Father Comes Home, well, actually I'm going to go far, far back. My play Neighbors premiered at the Public Theater in the same season as Father Comes Home from the War Parts 1, 2, and 7.
Yes.
So I'm actually one of the few people in the world who's seen Part 7.
You and me.
Yeah, exactly. And I was doing my play Neighbors there, which involves minstrel characters, and I think in some ways was drawing very heavily on Suzan-Lori's influence, and also Carol Walker and many other people working in that generation in a very specific way. So that's the trauma coming out, by the way. I remember we'd had our first dress rehearsal, And the actors came out in their blackface and wandered around the public lobby just to freak people out. And everyone's upset and scared and pulling out their camera phones because this is pre-iPhone. And Suzan-Lori Parks, unperturbed, looks around and goes, "Well, it looks like it's Black History Month already." And of course, I will never forget this, feeling as afraid as I was in her presence, having never met her. But she was in that process of working. Anyway, so then flash forward, we're up for this very fancy award, and it's neck and neck, apparently, I hear, as you do from like the panelists on these awards. And the deciding factor ultimately was that the chair decided that it was important that the play go to the award go to a play that could be a teaching tool for high school students. And it sent me into an interesting place of wondering about what is history in relationship to drama, and how should it be treated? And specifically with this play, one of the things that I wrestle with actively is, in fact, what you're hinting at, which is the pastiche and use of the Odyssey as sort of a armature around which Suzan-Lori has built this world. And this is not uncommon, actually, from her practice. All of her work is about reinterpretation. It's about wrestling with the mythic, which means you must have a myth there to wrestle with. But I also think a lot about obviously, like representations of slavery, being a descendant of slaves. And I definitely, when I think of slavery, I think very quickly of Orlando Patterson's work and this notion of slavery as the vehicle for social death, and social death being a kind of primary result of that. And yet the theater is a social form. And so I wonder, how do we reconcile in a social form a phenomena of social death? And what exactly is, essentially my question is every play that takes on slavery or represents slavery, is it always in essence a fantasy, right? Given that there is no archive against which to measure verisimilitude. And is there a cost to fantasy, or is there, what is the productiveness of fantasy? And what might be the risks inherent in it? Another question I have for Suzan-Lori that I share this criticism, and I'm interested in having a discussion about it. There's a lot of question about the labor of the actor inside of the world of a Black playwright. And I remember meeting, I've been kind of gossipy, I'm sorry, I really love this play and I love Suzan-Lori, but this is just what's coming to me. But during the early sort of auditions for this play, there was a bit of a kerfluffle in the community about like what it meant to be asked to play a chorus of less than desirable slaves. And I, of course, am consistently asked, so why am I asking people to don blackface or play slaves? But I am curious to talk about the playwright specifically as a manufacturer of labor opportunities, and how this is always sort of a complicated negotiation for a Black writer, and that you want to provide opportunities for artists of color often, but you're also met with market forces and critical discourses that often struggle with representations that are more expansive than what we've inherited from, say, something like Gone with the Wind, right? It's about identifiability ultimately and quick recognizability. And so I think that's a discussion worth having, because Suzan-Lori has lived, and why she is so inspiring to me is she has lived in this space of contention for so long and so freely and so openly. And often when I think a lot about how Suzan-Lori and Lynn Nottage right now are sort of literally the best American playwrights alive. And they're both Black women. Lynn just broke the record for the Pulitzer, and yet they on paper are exactly the same, and yet they are so different in their attack and thoughts on the work, and there's always the question for either of them, like, what is your obligation to a community, and also a community of artists that might look like yourself, and how does that play out in the work itself? That's just improvisation. I'm just afraid to keep going, so I'm going to stop now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, I have like big, fat softball kind of things that really just sum up and rep and rev a lot of what you all have said. So I'm going to try and, I'm asking some questions to sort of allow us to pull out these points a little bit further. So I want to begin maybe by spending a bit of time continuing to think about the various ways that this play of hers in particular mines, obviously, the massive tropes of freedom and sovereignty and agency and self-making from a variety of different vantage points, which you each have actually beautifully meditated on, both in terms of form and content. In a sense, each of our three principal characters, Hero, Penny, Homer, but actually even Odyssey and the Fugitive Runaways, each of these characters are improvising the meaning of her, his, or their own freedom quite distinctly. And so I wonder if you all could share with us the ways in which we might obviously think of this play as rehearsing a variety of ways in which to define the condition of being free. You've all talked about that, but I think if we could draw that out a little bit more, it would be a generative framework in which to kind of swim right now. And likewise, I wonder if any of you would be willing to continue to speak about the ways that the play is clearly marking the delineations potentially between freedom and emancipation, that these two concepts are not necessarily one in the same. So if we can spend some more time doing freedom time, to cite my wonderful colleague Anthony Reed, who has a great chapter on Susie's really hard, obscure early plays, go look for it. But if we can think more about freedom in relation to this play, any way you all want to come at it.
Okay, I'll start off. So one of the characters that I thought about that I don't think has gotten enough attention, and you certainly brought it up, Michael, is the Smith character. Because he's a free black person, right? That becomes evident in, the conversation with he and the Colonel. And so that to me it's another sort of slippage there in terms of what it means to be free, what it means to be a person who's already free. He wasn't free-born, he was a slave. That comes out.
Right.
And so what it shows is also the precarity of the condition of free African Americans.
Yes.
That freedom for them was not an absolute, that freedom was also quite contingent. And so there's that scene, those scenes with him, first with him and the Colonel, in which the Colonel has no idea who he's talking to, and he's giving the sort of a
Neither
lesson.
does the audience. Neither does the audience.
Exactly. He's giving the Colonel a lesson in class relations. Remember that part where he's talking about his encounter with a working class white person from the South who's fighting for the Confederacy on behalf of a rich man.
Yes.
And in turn, the Colonel is trying to school him on what it means to be a slave without knowing that he actually knows something about that.
Right.
You know nothing about us.
Right, exactly, from firsthand experience. And then the kind of interaction that he has with Hero, in terms of the bond that eventually forms around the common recognition of what it means to be a slave and a former slave.
Yes.
But also he's captive. Smith is a captive, and then Hero has some agency, some control over his fate in a sense. And so it really enriches the conversation, I think, to bring in his character as a free African American, and sort of reckoning not just the status of black people who are enslaved, but what happens to those who are already free, and how free are they really?
Let's keep going with Smith if we can, maybe. Can we live any other way you want to talk about freedom? Obviously, we could do that all night. But I want to hold on to Smith, especially at the level of dramaturgy and the vision of the playwright, since we know some things about Susie's choices with regards to casting that character. But other ways of hanging out with questions of freedom and sovereignty in this work.
And I'd be interested in the casting, because that was I was curious about.
Yeah, and the actor who was in the public production has also worked on at least one of Brandon's plays. So
Louis Cancelli.
Louis, yeah, who's a Yale alum. Drama school. Yeah. But yes, I
think that whole part is fascinating in a couple of ways. One, it triggers a lot of seemingly familiar material, the whole taking off a jacket and putting on a jacket,
Yes.
that if I have this jacket on, I'm a captain, and therefore I'm white, and I have this jacket on, I'm private, and therefore I'm black. And the question of how that stops or fixes, if at all, at a certain point. And so the mark is one answer, I think the most powerful one that they give. But it's interesting that when he's introduced, he says to the colonel something along the lines of, you could make me swear to the rebel cause and own 100 slaves, but I'd still be a Yankee because I have Yankee blood. And it's with so there's this notion of identity as no matter what I look like or I'm doing, who I am is down there inside of me. But then, of course, the whole theme of passing and putting on these disguises and doubling undercuts that entirely. It's that, well, no. So as a casting decision, my students were very interested in it, and I put the question to them, I'm like, how would you cast Smith? Does he need to be a white man who looks like he could pass? Couldn't you just have someone who looks black and say, well, I'm pass? If the fiction is, it could be any of these things, how does that play out in terms of the casting choices? So the character is very interesting to me. I'll say just two quick things. One, I'm not sure how that whole part of between Hero and Smith, with the taking on and putting off of identities, how that cashes out in the third part. Because when he comes back and it's like, oh, I have this other wife, and now my dog is back, even though he left me before, I'm not sure what in the second part motivates some of those things in the third. And so I'd be interested in talking about that. And then to use Harvey's term about, to go back to freedom of slippage, I love the fact that there's a slippage between freedom and emancipation, which is literally the note doesn't get passed to them before they run away. But the question is, are they maybe even more free now than if they had been emancipated and stayed where they are? And it seems to me there's where this play contributes to a reckoning in our current moment of rethinking a narrative of American history in which emancipation does not mean freedom. And it's not just the colonel who gives a first promise and a second promise and a third promise, and it keeps receding in the horizon. That's our narrative. That's the first American Republic, and the second American Republic, and the third American Republic. And so I thought that was like a great innovation.
I mean, the complexities of the sartorial transformations along with the name change suggest a way to think about, as our colleague Erica Edwards in Black Literary Studies talks about Black folks' proximities to and intimacies with the state. I mean, he becomes Ulysses, but he also becomes Ulysses, as in Grant, in terms of thinking about one's, kind of entanglements with, modern forms of domination over Black people, right? So there's that. One other thing that I was also thinking about, just in terms of the long kind of Black theater history that resonates and haunts Susie's work, is that moment of the taking on and off of the garments and the name change and everything, that's William Wells Brown, 1857, The Escape, which is our earliest extant African-American drama, which features a captive turned fugitive named Cato, who actually is going through this long scene, this long monologue where he's trying on all of these different clothes, and it's really kind of the sort of negotiation of the changing of the clothes that constitutes this moment of radical potentiality of freedom. So there's so much embedded in that scene. I'm glad that we're living in that for a second. But my two wonderful, esteemed other geniuses here to my left, if you'd like to help us out.
I mean, I can't. Sorry, I keep thinking about Suzan-Lori as the artist here. I think that when I think about freedom, I think of things like it's about choice, it's about not knowing, it's about being able to go in any direction you want. And I think it's really profound that she's chosen this sort of episodic structure, that every piece is sort of a modular, contained. I mean, granted, part 1 and 2 are ultimately resolves of each other. There's a sense that there's a kind of picaresque quality to the experience that feels that it holds a kind of question of freedom formally. And I think that there's something, I always am saying, I bet she's never going to finish these plays. There's something about, but there's something to talk about though. What does it mean that we're all waiting for 4 through 9?
Yeah.
That there's something about the the promise of that
Yeah.
is actually what haunts, I think, everyone's excitement about it. And that is its own kind of freedom, because anything can happen. And again, we saw
That
part
is the black
7.
condition. We're still waiting.
We're still waiting, right? Well, right,
waiting.
but she can do whatever she wants, right? And then so part 7, which I saw with you saw part, they took it away.
I saw it because
And then
I was
9
there to do the talk back for neighbors.
Right, that's right. And then in
Yeah.
part 9, which was
Yes.
actually a video that she made, and she also she came out and sang songs
Yes,
that kind of
yes,
bookended the
yes.
evening. And I think they might still be actually in the script, but she but this idea of the art that she was exercising
Yes.
freedom. This is all
Yes.
one kind of major
Yeah.
artistic project for her
Yeah.
that goes not just from the stage but into her own kind of process.
Yes.
And I think that'll be the sum total of the experience
Yes.
once we've gotten through the nine
Yes.
parts. I wonder.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just.
Dean Young. I'm calling you Dean. You're a dean now,
Yeah, that's
brother.
I've been a dean for 3 months right now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, just a couple quick thoughts in terms of on freedom and emancipation. There isn't a clean line that separates the two, and that occurs here certainly within the character of Penny. Right, you feel sorry for her at the end because this potential escape with Homer actually becomes a level of domestic confinement, right, and imprisonment at the end of that play. But even the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, it's helpful to. I love the last line in the play where it's like they miss it, but they still have to. I think Odyssey says something, you still have to run or something like that. Like I think that's the line. Because even the Emancipation Proclamation, right, which we imagine as being the thing that liberated everyone, only freed slaves in states at war with the North. But if you were a slave in Delaware, you were still a slave, right? Even with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So there's a way in which there is a free is never truly free, right? Or you can think about how slave patrols, then morph, and some legal scholars have written about this, have morphed into racial profiling, with police, right? So it's, and you can look at the trend toward mass incarceration really beginning, with the free, with the end of slavery, right? So you can see the uptick in terms of not only convict leasing, but in terms of the number of black bodies incarcerated. So that gets really complicated. And then just in terms of the structure of the play, it's helpful to remember that Suzan-Lori Parks did the 365 Days Plays project, and Becca Rugg, when she was still here, or she still might have a role here in some capacity, was the producer on the university circuit here. But Father Comes Home from the Wars, the title at least, appeared in 9 parts across that year, with no real connection, to this. So that's your own kind of weird thing where you have different associations of where she's beginning with this 9-part series. And lastly, I'll say that when I think 9 parts, I keep thinking Star Wars, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you start figuring out like which are your favorites of the parts, and then
There's no question about which favorite you have of Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly, right. And you start thinking like,
Episode
do you
4,
watch
what are you
all 9 parts, or do you assemble your own constellation of this?
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's important to note that Father Coming Home from the Wars is a motif that goes back as far as imperceptible mutabilities, right? That, like, in some ways, the
Yes.
freedom is in the revision.
Her earliest
you
work.
know.
Yeah, the free rep and rev, right? I want to stick with precarity maybe a little bit longer here. The other obvious yet major pressing question that seems like this play is always hailing us to consider is that freedom, as we've just been discussing, is not only an elusive concept for people subjugated to, as my colleague Gary Tomlinson very powerfully, cogently described it the other night, a people who are subjugated to half a millennium of enslavement. So freedom is a precarious entity. It always threatens to vanish or to never fully materialize. So I wanted us to maybe sit a little bit longer with how we understand this play, which we've just been discussing, that Parks has been working on for, I mean, if we had to give a time frame for this, I thought Harvey might know this, Dean Young. Are we talking about like over a decade? When was the Neighbors?
2009,
2009, okay, yeah. But that was, in that form, I remember experiencing it as a song structure initially, right? She came out with her guitar. She talked about it. She was just learning how to play guitar. At the time, she had a musician partner. She now has a band. She, plays at the Signature, right? But, so I want to come back to that, about thinking about form. But, how do we understand this play to be as much about 1862 as it is about 2018, as Harvey was just referencing for us. I want to make sure that for those folks who don't hang out in academic worlds, that we bring into the room the massively influential work of the scholar Saidiya Hartman, who reminds us that, quote, if slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery, Professor Hartman argues: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment, end quote. So we know that Parks, her works often reference these kinds of entanglements with the afterlives of slavery, from the America play to Venus, the Red Letter plays, Top Dog, Underdog. She offers us both in form and in content ways with wrestling with the liminality of historical temporalities, born out of slavery, conflation of past and present. But I wanted to ask the panel if you all can help us to think about the ways that this play, in very specific ways, formalistically, form and content, calls attention to that kind of slippage, to go back to Harvey's formulation, between the catastrophes and emergencies of the Civil War and enslavement, and a kind of constant awareness of our present conditions. And I would say that this is, of course, one of the real, breakthrough innovations of Brandon's work, to make use of the anachronism in very particular ways. But I was wondering if there were particular anachronisms in the play that you all are drawn to that can help us to understand the power of Parks's slippages. So anyway, we can kind of continue to live with Susie creating this world that moves back and forth for us, and what kind of knowledge we can draw out of that. If any of you would like to help us with that, that would be great.
Oh, you're looking at me. Okay. That's a huge question, Professor Brooks. And I don't know how to start. Maybe to think about how does she, the whole notion of devaluing Black life in the marketplace. So that's something that really stuck with me in terms of the question that's posed. Am I actually worth less as a free person because I'm worthless, as in not monetized?
Yes. Market and market.
Right. So that question, I think, really says a lot about the connections to, the through line to, what happens post 1865. So if we think about how the labor of slaves, or former slaves, became devalued because it doesn't have the same market value that it once had in the context of slavery. If we think about Jim Crow, the emergence of sharecropping, and how Black labor was devalued, how Black life was devalued with disenfranchisement, with lynching, with even what becomes permanent unemployment. The rates of permanent unemployment really skyrocket in the 20th century, which is something that's really phenomenal if you think about the fact that African Americans have always been central to the labor of this country, central to the economy of this country, and to get to a point where that labor is no longer valued. To the point that people are literally kicked out of the economy. So that line also, I think the moment of hands up, don't shoot, that image sort of came to mind, sort of thinking about what's happening right now with police violence.
Which she's always claimed that she wrote before that became aligned with the Ferguson moment.
Which is totally believable, which also then says how powerful, it makes it even more powerful, right? That is a motif that was recognizable even before it became
over and over
popularized.
Right.
So, I don't know, as a historian, I'm always sort of grappling with that that through line, but I think those are some of the things that mark the play for me in terms of thinking about what happens literally in the afterlives of African Americans as former slaves and the denigration that really, and so we have this sort of progressive narrative of sort of civil rights, from slavery to freedom to civil rights, when I think the line is actually not so straight. It's much more crooked. It's much more, it's less linear than we tend to tell in our nation's history.
Sometimes I think she just can't help herself because it's funny. So like, we're running
The
together.
anachronisms.
Yeah, right. So it comes up in the language, and it's like, so let's get out of here. We're running buddies, or I'm gonna jet, or something that it's a playfulness in the language in which it's just like it kind of feels to me like she's saying, and I think I agree, that we got a better way to say that now. And I'm just going to throw that in there. And I don't care if it's anachronistic. So part of it is just that level, but I think this idea of non-linearity, when it comes into language, is recursive. So it's the language kind of always doubling back on itself, and I think that takes two different forms. One is with like the stage direction, hands up, don't shoot. It's even more resonant if, in fact, it happens before, because it just shows that it's tapping into something that's recurrent and coming. But it's also, I think, the way she'll take very contemporary ways of thinking and speaking about questions and problems and putting them in the mouths of characters from 1862, 1863. So that when Smith says, sometimes I get the feeling that the heart of the thing won't change easy or quick because of the way we were bought and brought over here in the first place. There's a character that's not the character you would normally get in this play, who's like in the midst of a kind of very immediate struggle to achieve emancipation, and that's the horizon. It's thinking about a longer history back, but it's also thinking forward about the ways we talk about it now. So it's not necessarily anachronism so much as you see a kind of, as it's not retrospective, it's prospective. That something's going forward. And I also think in that that moment, the moment when the colonel breaks down in part 2, and then he's got to recover himself, but he's like, but I thank God every day that I'm white.
Which is the pivotal turning point for a lot of audiences who maybe thought they were seeing a different kind of play. For me, when I've experienced that play with predominantly white audiences, it is the moment in which, pardon my French, people have to reckon with the fact that we are not fucking around.
Right. It's like...
I'm sorry.
No.
we use the F-bomb at Yale.
Exactly. I'll give.
Speaking of language, anachronisms, contemporary colloquialisms, vernacular language, very central to your absolutely award-winning historic work, An Octoroon, and many of your other works. And you've talked about this before, how you think about those kinds of, again, to use Harvey's term, slippages. I was wondering if maybe you could help us to think about, from a playwright's point of view, what you're doing with history and time and affective proximity.
I think, weirdly, you've taken sort of the words out of my mouth. I was actually going to use this quote on your page here, which is about, well, first of all, language is just one of many tools in the drama, right?
Yes.
And it is a tool that Suzan-Lori just possesses a pure genius for, that is like unmatched, and you kind of can't teach that to people. Like, you'd have students who have it or don't, and she, through the kind of heightened language, what she's opening up is a space of like possibility and otherness, otherworldliness, right? It opens up a conceptual space in which we can put things next to each other, or reconceive of ideas in contrast or in comparison, maybe. Whereas I feel like I've taken historically a more like, I don't know how to describe it, but like for me, language is the tool through which audience distance or closeness is created, right? So she builds this otherworld language that she possesses, that we all have to enter into together, and that has a unifying effect on an audience as they receive it. But if you have a play, like I've steal some of this from a lot of folks, Shakespeare and Brecht and many people, if you play with many registers, right, you can reveal divisions within an audience, right, in terms of comprehension, that those divisions might in themselves be a part of the art that you're building, right? So famously in Octoroon, I have a stage direction where I'm like, I don't know how slaves sounded like, and neither do you, right? And that is about, that is about reminding people that like any judgments we want to bring on representation are rooted in our own fictions about what that erased moment in history is about, right? So, and I have the women speaking in this way that people have described as variously as urban slang, as real housewives of plantation. I mean, traumatic language used, but like Ebonics, someone threw that once out. And for me, that was engaging language that I actually identify as camp, and I think that like when people denigrate the use of things like yeah, girl, they disregard the fact that its users might be aware of the irony in its deployment, right? So that being said, there's something about what she, I feel like, is doing in these moments where, when you're teaching about how to write about history or writing historical fiction, you have to remember that if you're, again, going for very psychological realism, characters don't know the future, right? And so it's interesting that she has characters choose to reflect deeply on this idea of having been brought over in a ship, when in reality, like, when had the importation of slaves been outlawed? I'm sure some historian here can help me out, but like, a slave walking through Reconstruction in all likelihood did not come here on a ship, nor did they have understanding of how they came here, nor did they have any sense of what freedom would mean tomorrow and how their lives would look different. So I think that what she's doing is, again, she's working through myth. She's working through shared myths, and she does it on a level of language, on not only trying to build a new language in which we can all consider the myths, but also, giving the myth voice, giving the thing we receive voice, and allowing it to respond to itself and other myths, So that's maybe what I think of when I think of that question.
I want to be mindful of our time, especially as I feel the audience is beginning to turn on me. Maybe just the GLC, since I'm remembering this is recorded, so you can edit out the blue language. But I have just a couple more questions to ask. So much of this play has to do with, as we were discussing last night amongst ourselves, the question of choice, and more specifically, forms of consent and domination. Consent and choice are both further complicated by questions of intimacy, loyalty. So I wondered if any of you would like to speak to the various ways that these tropes work in the play, loyalty, choice, consent, what they suggest to us more broadly about the complexities of enslavement and escape, intimate human responsibility, what the scholars Christina Sharp and Judith Butler have each referred to as forms of beholdenness. How can we be beholden to one another? How does Parks draw on these kinds of themes to try to convey what we, just to pull off of what we were just referencing, what we rarely discuss in relation to Civil War history and histories of enslavement, how we think about consent and intimacy, loyalty, domination, choice, any of those concepts in the play.
Well, this is not thought through at all, but I would just offer some. It's because with your question, it made me think about the play that I saw yesterday, and then just examples of this, and what I think of as a sense of obligation, an obligation of return, right? So at the end, you're obviously waiting for the return of hero / Ulysses, and what is it that motivates this person to go back home, right? Or think about Odyssey, talking about how I searched for you, and there is this sense of responsibility. The word that keeps popping in my head is the sense of duty, that becomes a sign of character. Right, like not of a role a person plays, but of that sense of self that has an ethical and moral dimension, and that's something that seems worthwhile. In the same way that when Penny articulates the sense of waiting and longing, and how one stays true to another person even while engaging in a relationship with another, right? And so there is there's a depth and a complexity to the characters that's emerging. Through this sense of obligation to return, the sense of fidelity.
I was thinking about that same point, and that, we sometimes say, there's I like your word armature for the Odyssey and these myths, and it's fun to kind of decode and see the correspondences and everything. But I think in her work, with Hawthorne and these other people, sometimes she's just showing us that stuff's really messed up. in certain ways, and that she's going to kind of fix it a little bit and make it better. And so when you think about standards of fidelity and faithfulness in the Odyssey, and that it opens up with Odysseus like up on Pleasure Island with, what's her name again? Calypso. And Penelope's just supposed to wait there for 30 years, you know, with these. And then he comes back and, oh, it's him. And so it's as if those 30 years. So I kind of like it that at the end, like, she's out. That's it's messed up to expect that she just kind of sit there the whole time and wait. So the stuff about American history and race is so powerful, but I think reading Tara's work and thinking about her comments too reminds us that this is a feminist play as well, and thinking about Penny's role at the end kind of brought that up for me.
Yeah, Professor Honor, I don't know if you
Well,
help us out with that
just
one.
to maybe think a little bit about the concept of consent and loyalty. So thinking about the relationship between boss and hero. So, you know, boss sort of both orders hero to follow him, but also says it's a choice, right? And so why would he do that? Well, partly because of the context of the war. You know, what would it mean to take a slave in that context in which there are weapons and it's a very contentious environment? You don't want necessarily a slave to be following you who's not necessarily willing on some level to be there. So giving slaves incentives to go and serve is one way of dealing with that. So that kind of creates a complicating factor for Hero, is trying to figure out what really are his options. Does he truly have an option to go or not go? And just the way in which she depicts the relationship between the two, it's a very conflictual relationship in terms of questions of consent and choice, but also loyalty, because there's a kind of love-hate there in terms of, from both perspectives. You know, obviously, boss looks at more favorably upon Hero than vice versa, but there is a sense, there is some element of loyalty, that there's a kind of pull that he has on Hero. At the same time, he wants to kill him. So it's a very complicated love-hate relationship. And it also, I think, really dramatizes the kind of psychological toll that slavery has on the people who are held captive.
And the complex intimacies, right?
Right.
Born out of captivity, both for the captor and the captive.
Right, and that was touched on a little bit in terms of the, you know, what does it mean to serve, right? In terms of the kind of physical labor that a servant provides for a master, bathing him, scrubbing him. That's also very complicated.
One more question before I hand it over to the crowd. Might we have a word about music? One of my favorite topics. Music in this work, the role of the musician played by the magnificent Martin Luther McCoy. For those of you who are fans of the Roots or who've spent a lot of time, like myself, at Black Rock Coalition and Afropunk gigs around the country, it's a thrill to hear and see the ways that he instills this role with bold and nuanced affective complexity. Parks, we know, as we were just mentioning, is herself a budding musician, I would say. And some of us have had the pleasure of hearing her. So I'm interested in how we think about the importance of this role, and really how both the musician and our pooch Odyssey are potentially crucial griots, so Black diasporic traveling storytellers, poets, musicians, who can potentially convey something fundamental about Parks's vision of theater. This actually, I think, maybe gets us back to the point that Brandon was kind of pointing us towards, of thinking about the tension between taking the phenomenon of social death and using a social form to interrogate that kind of crises. So to what extent can we think about the ways that theater and music allow us to, and storytelling allow us, and kind of the project of storytelling allow us to engage history on multiple frequencies in this play, right? So why the musician is one way of thinking about it. Why Odyssey, this like fabulous scene stealer of a character played brilliantly in this current iteration. Why these figures, and how do we understand them in relation to Parks's larger project of using theater towards something else or other worlds, or to think otherwise? Help me out.
Yeah, I'll go, I
I'm
guess.
going to leave that to the experts.
I'm still trying to think, I mean, for Odyssey, Odyssey really sort of plays that chorus, griot role, because you learn so much about what's happened between part 2 and part 3. So that relay of information is extraordinary. But to conflate things and talk about musical theater.
Yes.
I mean, it really, like, that moment, essentially that monologue really feels like a showstopper to me. Right? It has that, like, there's a rush of energy that, in some ways, the pacing is atypical of the play prior to that moment. So it jumpstarts part 3, and because if you think about it, there's a person could think that part 2 is the end, right? And so what is it that connects part 2 to part 3? And I suspect that if you were, like, standing in the during intermission, you might ask yourself as an audience member, like, what questions do I have unanswered? At that point. Will they return? Perhaps, but I'm not sure if that really sort of motivates one's great curiosity for part 3. But that sense of questioning goes away and disappears with this dynamic monologue.
Delivered by a dog.
By a dog, right? Which also sort of shifts what you've seen previously in terms of the characterization of these roles. And now for the musician, that one I'm still trying to figure out. And I had lunch with Jocelyn Prince, who is awesome, one of my favorite people in the whole world. I'll just say it again, Jocelyn Prince, one of my favorite people in the whole world. And we're talking, and I think that I could imagine how across, I have no idea, because I didn't see part 7. So I'm not sure if the musician plays a role in part 7, but I could see how we know that the blues connects Black history across time. You think about the evolution across sorrow songs and spirituals, to the present day and onward. And I could see that character really being what unites a 9-part series. So that's how I was thinking about it in terms of the expanded trajectory of this play.
If we think about Black Sound as being the archive for Black people to store their history when they had no access to institutions, to build museums on the Mall in Washington, D.C., libraries. It is kind of that mobile archive of memory that weaves like a thread through this epic.
And that pings for me, thinking again about the Odyssey as like a master text, pun intended. It was sung by one person,
Yes.
right? And in this play especially, and this sort of began around In the Blood, but Suzan-Lori has an incredible facility with the tragic form. And I think she's consistently referencing it. And they kind of are all built in these sort of Euripidean ways that kind of stack together in a fun way. And so, yes, there's something about sound for her. And also she speaks all the time about her process is about channeling. She feels that she's speaking to ghosts, which I understand in some ways. That there's a sense of the music containing the mystical, containing the transcendent, that contains the freedom somehow, right? That that's the thing that literally shakes the body that binds you.
The fugitive element.
That's right. And just thinking also about the fact that she's appropriating not just the Odyssey as a Greek text, but the form, and these were two forms that came out of slave societies, right? So there's a kind of topsy-turvy quality to even in the act of appropriating them for herself. That music is somehow the thing that animates them all,
Appropriate.
Liberating the music somehow,
I think this is the moment when we hand over the room to the audience. I would imagine there are many questions. This has already been such a dynamic conversation, so we invite you all, with or without profanity, to come forward and ask our esteemed panelists any questions that you may have. I see one of our magnificent
Goodness.
dramaturgs on top of being chair of dramaturgy at Yale School of Drama, Catherine Sheehy.
I was the dramaturg on the production of Father Potemkin War, so I have thoughts about almost everything that you guys have said. Having lived with this magnificent text for several months now, and I thank you so much. It was so insightful, great the quality of this play. You get to keep learning about it every time. I did want to talk a little bit about speak a little about part 3 and how part 3 belongs. I think one of the most extraordinary passages that didn't get mentioned here today is Ulysses' explanation to Homer that the boss didn't free him, and what happened to him when the boss didn't free him, and how the boss, how he said, I don't take after him in looks, but I do take after him, and how I think in a way that Homer, hero, becomes Ulysses because he ingests the market that the white man has set up for him. So essentially, he comes back to, we lost Evan. He comes back to the place almost as a white man, almost as a boss master himself in a way.
Ulysses.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly. And that's something that so she sort of does. That frees her. She goes into the house with murder in her heart. And the chorus, including, I think it's very interesting, that the chorus is 1, 2, 3, first, second, leader, second, third, first, second, third, runaway. But they're very delineated as people. And Sophia Fredericks, who's right here, who plays third, as the woman in the chorus, first as undesirable slaves and then as runaways, has a lot of these points to the ancient narrative of Medea, of Clytemnestra, of the woman who goes into the house with murder in her heart, and she begs her to come out to break that chain. So I think this notion of what happens to the black man also leads to this feminist reading of what the black woman at the center of this play, which is about how you free yourself, how you break that chain, and how you get out. And I think the slippage of the lyrics, because one of the things you think about the lyrics that are, Sophia, you've got Walk On By, and you've got Before I Be a Slave, I'll Be Buried in My Grave, and you've got Ain't Nobody Gonna Turn Me Around. And I think that Parks is pointing to the cultural, gift that the African American woman has made, even as it's almost invisible, even as it's buried in the play. I mean, I just could talk about this play forever, but I did want to point to that monologue about how he says, so that I could make it so that I could breathe, I cut my soul out of myself and I gave it to him, or I lost it somehow. And I think that's what makes it, that's actually what frees Penny, is that it's not hero, it's who comes back, it is Ulysses that comes back. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have one back here. Hi.
Hi.
I came in late, so forgive me if this might have been addressed, but I'm curious about, in particular, what struck me in the play was sort of this idea of ability, and that Homer has his foot cut off, that Smith has an injury where he could or could not walk, that the hero has to make the decision about whether to cut off his foot in order to run or be able to walk. And I see it resonate in Death of the Last Black Man, where there are these 2 watermelons on the black man's hands where he can't move, or Joe Turner's Come and Gone, where Harold Loomis is very much like, I can't walk at that in the back one. So wondering about reflections of how ability is used within the play, and how maybe Parks is trying to continue a through line about the pain of enslavement is yes, a mental pain, but then also the physicalness of being able to run, which you might, if you're able to run away, have that privilege, versus others who, like Homer, may not be able to run anymore, or the oldest old man who may not be able to run anymore either.
Questions of mobility in Parks?
I mean, for me, it's tied to her general, I think she has a theory of the body, specifically the black body, that stretches across all the work. And that one step of emancipation is ultimately wrestling the ownership of one's body back from a system. But once you have it, do you then possess the freedom to do with it, to manipulate and capitalize on it in the way that has been capitalized in the past. So I think about that moment. I think of Hero cutting off his own foot. You know, I think about Venus. I think everything. I think about Hester killing Jabber.
Yeah.
You know, that in the absence of marketable skills, the one thing you can traffic in is flesh. You know, that's what that goes for me.
I think too, and this is just briefly, that there's something etymological about Oedipus and having a club foot, I think. And so I think she's picking up on this. And I was thinking that actually ties back to the earlier comment, because this question of you go to a play and you know how it ends, and so wherein resides the pleasure, and how that relates always in my mind to the possibility that you're being hustled. I really liked this answer because I didn't want it to be true when I was watching. You see part two and you want to think there's some transformation here. Hero becomes a better guy, he understands something now and he comes back. And so when he has a different name, you think, all right, our man is now going to do the right thing. But then you think, wait a minute, what did they say at the end of part one? We can't call you Hero anymore. And why? Because he's the same guy. The guy who the first time betrayed his friend, the second time betrayed his friend, and so he comes back and we're like, why are we but it's the same thing, right? It's like you're watching a play about Lincoln and Booth, and somewhere along the way you're thinking, you know what? Booth ain't gonna shoot Lincoln this time. It's gonna work out. And then at the end you're like, what? But then you're like, oh yeah, Booth shoots Lincoln. And it's kind of, I think, the same way with Hero. The trick here is that because of the name change, you think something's happened, but it's been signaled to you already in the first part. It's like, you had the wrong name to begin with. Now we're giving you the right one.
And that goes back to Brandon, your thing about labor, what you ask people to go through when they go through this thing. And for the young man playing Hero, of course you want to come back as the hero. And it's hard enough to play a captive. Because to play the captive who's not the hero at the end is a very hard thing to ask an actor.
It's a recurring theme in Parks, which we've already discussed. You know, we think about Venus, and that's still like a play that's wrenching for folks to have to question Sarah Bartman's own complicity with her subjection and subjugation. Did not make Parks friends with some black feminists, but you know, we're able now to hopefully tell these more complicated, as Harvey was pointing out, stories of black captivity as well as emancipation, and how that constitutes complicated subject formations. And that's in the archive. There are folks like the fugitive slave Henry Box Brown, who is not a triumphalist figure. Now, the brother mailed himself out of slavery in a box and did some badass things, but we know from the archive that he gambled, actually, right, which he was attacked for. He was in the archive, you read material on him where people claim, he wore too much jewelry, so he was completely crunk in all these ways, right? And he did not go back for his wife. So there are just these much more complicated ways of understanding our condition of being that Parks is after in her plays that we've definitely been touching on.
Can I just add something?
Yeah.
And this is something I've just been thinking about for the last few years that I haven't written about. It was just this sense of black injury and disability, and how that becomes a trope in a way, within sort of popular culture, whether it's the hobbling of Kunta Kinte, right? Porgy as well. Or you think about in a lot of August Wilson's plays, there's some level of injury or disability that allows the family to subsist, right, and continue. So think about Fences, right? It's Gabriel, right? It's the payments. It's the payments he received, that allowed Troy and his family to live. And then you think about the circulation of everything from the branding of the captives within this play. Or the markings of slaves and captives with scars. So there's something about like the hyper visibility of injured bodies, injured black bodies, physically maimed black bodies that recurs and marked, and that circulates, at a level where our sort of popular public fascination with blackness on stage or on screen often requires, the enactment of injury.
Coupled with, and this goes back to blackface, resilience, right? The injured body that nonetheless can pop up like a cartoon, which is part of the genealogy of blackface, and do it again, right?
Yeah, so if you think about Fences, it's like Gabriel dancing at the end, right?
Yes, yes.
Hi.
Hello, where is that voice? Hi, yes, hi.
I have two for. I'd love to hear the panel talk more about Hero's inability to steal himself. And then the other one is, I can't tell if you don't want to go here, but I'm a producer, so I'm interested to hear you talk about the casting around Smith, this idea of a white man playing a black man, if you don't mind.
So the concept of stealing oneself, which has all sorts of resonance in the Black Historical Archive and fugitive slave narratives, used as an ironic formulation to call attention to the absurdity of captivity in and of itself. But how we understand it in the context of the play, if anyone wants to speak to that.
I guess I would say his inability to steal himself is of a piece with the betrayal of Homer over and over, and the fact that he ends up as an anti-hero. I think Smith says at the end of part 2, well, maybe it begins by stealing ourselves, and then there's the pun because she writes, and also stealing ourselves, S-T-E,
Yep.
and that's what he won't do. And so I don't know how far I would want to push the analogy to Greek tragedy, but in as much as our hero has a fatal flaw, it seems like this is it, right? That he's never in the end going to steal himself, that he's always going to be following the boss master around, and thus why we can't call him hero in this kind of anti-heroic structure, which makes sense the more I think of it. Like if the vision of American history she's trying to make us question is an anti-triumphalist one, like Daphne was saying, why then would we want characters who enact this kind of triumphalist return?
Well, black people want it because we have these intense desires to imagine these alternative forms of.
And isn't that's the desire the play activates, right? And,
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think denies.
Okay. Does anyone want to talk about the Smith casting?
I could talk about it only because it's one of the many kind of funny things that haunt my work and haunted Octoroon is that thinking again as bodies and voice, language, and actors as tools and materials and vehicles. The effective moment she creates on that stage with that is one of oh my God, I thought that guy was white. Right, and in fact, genotypically, Louis Kitchelmy is white. So, oddly enough, he would self-identify as white, knowing I can speak that with confidence. And so,
which is itself a social construction.
Thank you so much. Still teaching me. I know, I got a C in your class. It's okay. Just kidding. I know, I'm just being the worst. Anyway, but oddly enough, though, this is this exact sort of dramatic trick. Trace has its roots in 19th century melodrama, specifically the Octoroon, in which Dion Boucicault cast his white wife in the part of the Octoroon, right? And that it is just neutrally thinking of it as a dramatic trick, creates still the same effect in people of wonder and mystery and confusion and worry, right? That kind of, and so I do, and at the same time, Louis Kitchelmy gets to say he played a black man on stage, and what does that mean, right? So there's the ways in which I think that is one of the open provocations in the piece, funnily enough, because also the work is premiering inside of a professional context in which it is illegal to ask an actor what his or her, how they identify, right? So there's a kind of guessing game that you're playing even in the construction of a production that is its own kind of interesting tension when you think about it. So
now I did hear from someone that it is her request, it is Parks' request that you cast that part of a person who self-identifies as white, so that there's no questioning on the part of the audience once he is initially introduced. So you can't cast Derek Jeter. You can't have, which for a lot of white people would still be that's a white guy. But for for other populations, it would be the moment of thinking about racial liminality. So.
But one of the things that she does within her scripts, one of the things that Suzan-Lori does within her plays is that she's mindful of the choices that casting directors will make. And she has spoken about how it's important for playwrights who want a certain image, a certain look on screen, to write that, to embed that within the language of the play itself. Right, because otherwise it's like the director, the casting director can like make other choices, and you find that, right? So you see, so you find, in The Blood, you have Amiga Gringa, that character, talking about having a white womb, right? And in this case, there's the presence of spells, right, which are essentially just sort of as described, right, it's these dialogue-free moments that are stacked where characters have to respond to a moment, but the presentation of that signals that hero at that moment is supposed to be sort of taken aback, because he did not actually recognize Smith as being African American, right? So those choices get baked into the play itself.
I think we may have time for one more question. If anyone wants to share anything. Oh, right next to you in the back, please, gentlemen.
Could you speak specifically about Parks' vision of tragedy, both in the context of African American theater, starting maybe with Langston Hughes' Mulatto, coming up to Jerry Baraka, Lorraine Hansberry, and Midnight, but also in the broader American canon, thinking of Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, Regina O'Neill. Is there something distinctive about Parks' vision of tragedy?
I think, I want to be very specific that when I talk about her relationship to tragedy, it is specifically Greek tragedy, not necessarily the broad genre sense of a thing that ends sadly. And I do think, similar to Arthur Miller, who in fact engaged that specific notion of Greek tragedy, there's an investment in this notion of the theater being an act of social reckoning, right? That, that essentially we are all, Greek tragedy literally grew out of the courts, essentially, right? So we are juries who are present to judge how a human life should be dispensed or not dispensed, right? And the job of the tragedian is to make you question your judgment about that, ultimately. Like the rules that are in place that would normally say the law of life that would make Willie Loman an unsympathetic figure, a crook, we, through the experience of Death of a Salesman, come to feel differently about how quickly we judge or condemn these people. So the kind of most classic example in Parks' canon is in The Blood, which she is very consciously adapting the tragic form for, right? And in that moment, there's a kind of conceptual element to that piece, which is about this notion of the welfare queen as a new archetype in American life, that at the time of its presentation, there was little talk of spaying. I was a babe at the time, but I've done my research. So, what that play ostensibly does is it forces us to re-question the way in which the society is literally condemning her, right? She shouldn't have it if she can't afford it, right? That's the kind of chorus idea happening. Here, I think that there's a weird hybrid thing happening in her work, where it is tragedy, but she is also playing with the epic, right? Yes. A tragedy has to end. That's how you define the tragedy. The tragedy is completed by the pity catharsis, reckoning the human destroyed person, and here again we have an open-ended form. We don't know parts 4 through 9. Right, and so it's hard to talk about what is happening, But and I think that's part of what she herself is actively asking. One of the things that strikes me about this play is that if you look at a lot of her work thematically, there's a moment of kind of mourning the black male, broadly construed, right? And then this thing opens up around the red letter plays where suddenly there is a focus on the black female in that space. Yeah. And here, in that context, it is always a black male who is the body on the floor at the end of the day, right? That black male death is a thing that haunts these works. And I feel like you're sensing Suzan-Lori work out how to handle that, And so, and this is oddly the first play in which the black guy doesn't die, and he's escaping. Yeah. And I think that's what's exciting about it. I'm like, now let's think about black male life coinciding along with black female life in perpetuity, and that's sort of the thing that kind of percolates under the surface for me in this. So, but in terms of like tragedy and like the sad sense of the Black sad story, I mean, Suzan-Lori has been incredibly freeing for an entire generation of artists because she was writing in a moment of questioning the notion of Black joy as the obligation of the Black artist, right? And that Suzan-Lori was thinking through what is the effective possibility of what kind of Black, it's in the equation for Black people on stage, right? It's her famous essay about this, right? She's like, what am I allowed to experience in a space versus my friends who aren't me, you know? And I think that for her, the idea of, there's always irony in the work. There's always sadness undergirded with something else that's happening. I think that for her, tragedy is only interesting insofar as it is a form to be manipulated or adapted in the way that her practice is always, again, about reinterpretation, re-envision, readapting, if that makes any sense. But forms always, for me, come with a social context and implied value system, right? And I think that's what becomes important to see her wrestle with, right, is what is an audience's relationship to the life unfolding on stage, you know?
That is probably a really great place to end, to think about how we sit with the work on stage and continue to wrestle with it. And I would like 2 rounds of applause, if I may ask from you. First, once again, for the extraordinary cast and crew as Father Comes Home from the Wars. My esteemed interlocutors who show us new ways of continuing to live with Susie's work and collaborate with her and carrying it into the future. So thank you to all of our wonderful guests here today.